Hey everybody, Dr. Wright here, and think of this as sort of a preview and proposal of a kind of reading group that we could do over the next couple of weeks or months. We don't really know we're coming back yet. And this is an adaptation of a course I taught at Ohio State, Classics 2220 Honors. Classical mythology, which was really heroic literature, from Gilgamesh, who's the black and white, there in the middle, to Odysseus, Achilles, Aeneas, Cuchulainn, and also Batman. Um, and so we covered in this course, starting with Gilgamesh, an ancient Babylonian epic, then the Homeric epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Sophocles, Philoctetes, and Ajax, the Aeneid, Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is also a movie coming out this summer. A couple of Norse sagas, the Saga of Rolf Kraki, which is sort of a retelling of Beowulf in some ways, and the Volsunga Saga, which is the basis for a lot of Lord of the Rings and also Wagner's Ring Cycle. Dante's Inferno, the Irish epic, which you've probably heard me mention before, the Tyne Bo Colleen, and then the movie The Dark Knight. Now, we wouldn't go over necessarily all of these. I would probably skip on the Greek tragedy and maybe just do Beowulf and Rolf Kraki and the Tyne. But certainly, I would like to do Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid at least, and then we can see where we go from there. That's all we don't have to worry about. I'll provide the text for you online, but we can start with just some basic context. So here's a map of the ancient Mediterranean with places like Rome, Carthage, Mycenae, Athens, Troy, Alexandria, Cyrene, all brought out there. So the major periods in Greek civilization, there's the Bronze Age, which is about the 4th century, 4th millennium rather, to 1200 BCE or BC, about the time of the Trojan War. The Dark Age from 1200 to 750, which is when, at the tail end of this, when the Homeric epics start to take form. Archaic Greece, where you have new forms of poetry that then start to react against Homeric epics. Classical Greece, where we get Greek tragedy. Then the Hellenistic period, which really goes down to about 31 BC, from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 to the death of Cleopatra VII in 31. So we're going to focus first couple of weeks really on Babylon, which is kind of off the map here, but Greece and Troy. And you see Troy is over there in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, across the sea. You might think it really took Odysseus 10 years to get back over there and longer for others, but also remember sailing is much tougher in antiquity. And also that Sturgis students always seem to really get in there to the underlying plot holes in myth. So these initial epics, the Homeric epics, are written in Greek, even though they start orally. They presume orality. Look at these early lines of the Odyssey. Speak memory of the cunning hero, the wanderer, blown off course time and again after he plundered Troy's sacred heights. Speak of all the cities he saw, the mines he grasped, the suffering deep in his heart at sea, as he struggled to survive and bring his men home. But he could not save them, hard as he tried. The fools, destroyed by their own recklessness when they ate the oxen of Hyperion the sun, and that god snuffed out their day of return. In fact, as you see on the other side here, our earliest example of Greek writing isn't strictly the Homeric poems, but it references them. It says that this cup, because it's on a cup, can carry stronger wine than the cup of Nestor, which is something we see in the Iliad. So that writing presumes knowledge of the Homeric poems. Some scholars even think that the Greek alphabet was originally devised, the Greek alphabet that we know, like in the top image here, purely to record the poems of Homer. But when they were written down and in what versions we have is a discussion we'll have in the first Iliad slide. Here's what the Greek alphabet looks like. Some of you might remember I used to have a poster of this in the classroom, but now it's gone. So as I said earlier, early archaic Greece, 750 to 650 BC, is around the time we think that these two poems came together. So it's the end of Bronze Age Greece, about 500 years earlier, is the period of the story's setting. So there's about a 500-year gap between when these poems come together and when the events, the Trojan War that they talk about, took place. And what happens in the intermediary there in terms of how these stories are created is a mystery. So the legends are about the fall of Troy. Troy was a real city. It was discovered by a German archaeologist and insurance salesman named Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, using the Homeric poems, the Iliad, as kind of a guide. Modern archaeologists, most notably Carl Blegen from the University of Cincinnati, determined that what they call Troy 7a, which was destroyed about 1184 BC, if that's the Troy in the Iliad, it would probably be that one, and there were other resettlements before and after. In the Iliad, the two key characters are Achilles, to an extent Agamemnon, and really also Hector, so three. But it also presumes a culture of oral poetry and performance. We'll talk about that when we get to Iliad 9, when the Achaeans come upon Achilles outside of his tent. He is singing the deeds of great heroes to his friend Patroclus. If we jump ahead to Beowulf and saga literature, because as I said, they are very much connected, the context here is the movement of various peoples in northern Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries, the traditions of skalds, which are Nordic poets, in Iceland, the preservation of Old Norse legends, and also the difference between Fornaldarsogur, which are, I mispronounced it, legendary sagas like the Volsunga sagas, and family sagas that retell more recent events like Egil's saga, which covers the initial settlements in Iceland from Norway. We're not talking about that one, but I recommend you read it because Egil is a fantastic character. And the groups that we see here are groups like the Frisians, the Jutes, the Danes, the Angles, the Swedes, the Wolfings, and the Gates, all of whom begin to migrate. The Angles, of course, going over to England, the Danes to an extent as well. If we move over just a bit to forward in time and also to Ireland, with Gawain and the Green Knight, which is part of the Arthurian cycle of stories. So it's a 14th century romance, part of alliterative Middle English verse, which is real fun. Some of them are Arthurian romances like this. Others are Crusade romances, or there's the one that I'm working on for my book on the destruction of Jerusalem. Even though it's the Roman War, it's got the kind of Crusade overtones. So Gawain and the Green Knight, about 14th century AD. The Táin is a 1st century AD story that gets preserved in 3 different recensions or recordings of the 12th century or later. So like with Homer, there's a big gap between when the story purports to happen and the version of it that we have. Gawain, you have the chivalrous hero and the ideas of chivalry, which we can talk about how medieval heroism is much different from ancient heroism or even modern heroism. And then in the Táin, you've got this young hero, Cuchulainn, who is in Ireland that's ruled by various minor kings in kind of 4 parts here. Cuchulainn is sort of, what if one person was all the Avengers at the same time? And so our very first text, and I have posted a translation to Study God on Google Classroom, is Gilgamesh, which takes us to what today is the modern country of Iraq. Back then it's Mesopotamia. And it's centered in the city of Uruk, which you can see is here on the Euphrates River, sort of close to the Persian Gulf. The earliest version of this story dates to 1700s BC. The standard version is from the 1200s to 900 BC. So this is before Homer. And again, there's a big gap between when the story takes place, because if Gilgamesh is a historical figure, he's ruling in 2800 to 2500 BC. So there's a 1,000-year gap between when the events might have taken place, or whatever their inspiration was, and then the actual story itself. I'm going to explain here that the version I've given you is by a translator named Stephen Mitchell, and it's almost an adaptation more than a translation, and that's because I feel that the Penguin translation, because of the way the text is preserved in fragments, literally clay tablets, I think it's very difficult for undergraduates, never mind high school students, to get through. So the Mitchell, the scholar will say it's not as accurate, but I think you'll get a much better grasp of the plot and the themes by reading that one. So the major figures in the text, and here's just a picture of Uruk today. I believe, yes, those are U.S. Army soldiers. So you can guess when this one was taken. The major figures are Gilgamesh, obviously. He's the king of Uruk. And then there's his a rival and later friend, Enkidu, the wild man. Later, we meet a man named Utnapishtim, who is a man who survived the Great Flood and became immortal. So he's kind of like Noah, except he became immortal. At a certain point in the epic, Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight Humbaba, who is a monster of the cedar forest. They'll come up against Ishtar, the goddess of sexuality and love. And so that's kind of an analog to Greek Aphrodite and Roman Venus, whom we'll come back to. And then there's the figure of Shamhat, who is a temple prostitute who civilizes Enkidu. But based on her occupation, you can guess that she has a very specific way that she civilizes him, and we'll see that this epic can be very earthy in a sense that even Homer, certainly not Virgil, will get to. So the major themes of the epic are the hero as monster slayer, which is not as big a deal in Homer and Virgil, but is a big deal, say, in Beowulf. The arrogance of the hero, death in the hero, that's a theme we're going to come back to over and over again, heroic friendship, and the relation between heroes and the divine, which is something we see much more in ancient heroic epic and myth, because it's a much different question when you're dealing with, say, a Christian hero like Gawain. So, we don't have to worry about this. What's Carmen? It's sort of like Google Classroom for Ohio State. But if folks are interested in this, I will put up one for Gilgamesh walking us through that epic next week. So stay safe, stay healthy, stay far away from people, and hopefully we'll be back at some point.